So this happened on New Year's Eve. To give some backstory, I lived in the more country part of South Carolina, in a small town. I'm a male and I was 16 at the time. My two best friends, Lisa and Tammy, who were both females, were also 16. The three of us went to the same school as well. Basically, my two best friends and I liked to explore abandoned buildings, and we decided it would be cool to celebrate New Year's at an abandoned house. We all live within the same block, so we just meet at the local park every afternoon and hang out. At 3 o'clock I headed to the park where both of them were already waiting. Lisa suggested to go to the abandoned building in the outskirts of the town. Tammy and I liked the idea, so we scheduled a plan. I will advance the boring part. 8 o'clock hit, and I got on my coat and headed outside. Tammy and Lisa were waiting for me outside. As I said before, the town I live in is very small, so it only took us like 15 minutes to find the house. I could feel the cold breeze over me. It was freezing. The house wasn't by any means huge, but it was nonetheless terrifying. Broken windows, poor condition wood, it was just like the typical cliché abandoned house in a movie. Lisa was overly excited to go inside. However, I could see Tammy wasn't all in it with the idea of entering the house. I think she was scared, but I encouraged her to go inside. I approached the main door and tried to open it. It was locked, as expected. But it was also very old, so I gave it a kick and knocked it down. The three of us went inside, each of us with a lantern. I instantly got this awful smell, like if something or someone was decomposing in there. I gagged. Tammy and I went to the kitchen, while Lisa went somewhere else. The kitchen was smelly, old, and it felt like no one had been in there for 100 years. However, I did notice something strange. There was a modern microwave sitting at the counter. It immediately caught my attention. This meant that someone had possibly been to this place, not so long ago, and maybe slept there or something, because there is no other way a modern microwave would make its way to this shithole. I told Tammy about it. She gave me a scared and panicking look. It was as if she had just seen death before her eyes. I tried calming her down, but just then, Lisa started whispering loudly for us to go to the living room with her. We rushed to where her voice came from. We asked her what happened. She pointed at the carpet on the floor with her flashlight. I asked her what about it. She whispered for me to look at it again, and so I did. That's when I noticed it. There was a stain on the carpet. Probably 4 or 5 inches wide. It was a sort of brownish reddish color. I was confused. I crouched down to look at it better. I pointed at it directly with my flashlight, and that's when the idea of it being dry blood came to my mind. I asked Lisa and Tammy if they thought it was blood too, but they both shrugged their shoulders. Around 5 to 10 minutes later, we got to the backyard. That's when everything that we feared became a reality. It was pitch black outside, but the light from our flashlights was enough for us to see it. There was like a sort of bump on the grass. We quickly approached it. That's when it hit us. The most sickening and nauseating smell we've ever smelt. I don't know how to describe it without getting the urge to puke. Tammy almost threw up right there. Lisa and I started digging up whatever was inside there with a shovel we found in the entrance to the backyard. The smell got worse the more we digged, and I felt like vomiting. After 1 or 2 digs, I hit something with the shovel. I flashed the light towards it. Right then, I felt my heart drop. There was a human foot, sticking out of the ground. The three of us ran away as fast as we ever have, leaving the house within less than 20 seconds. We kept running and running till we made it back to town. No one followed us, but the shock of seeing a human foot buried under the ground still gives me nightmares to this day. When we made it to our block, we decided to not talk about it and to just go home and go to sleep. Tammy suggested calling the police, but I instantly told her it was a bad idea. Gladly, Lisa agreed with me. I didn't want the police involved for several reasons, but the main one was to not get grounded for potentially a year. It's not like calling the police would help find whoever did that, since the body down there was probably 50 or 100 years old. So we didn't call the police, and that's how the worst New Year's Eve of my life ended. We never visited another abandoned building, but the three of us have remained close friends, even with all the time that's passed.
This happened on New Year's Eve of 2015. I just turned 17 a few days before. I worked as a babysitter at the time. I mostly just took care of children under the age of 2, which meant I'd just put them in bed at 8 o'clock while I stayed on my phone for hours till the parents came back. It was a really simple and easy job. So on New Year's Eve, I received a call from Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson lived like 30 minutes away on car. He had a huge house and I had already babysat his 18-month-old son before. I really wanted to hang out with my friends that night, but since Mr. Johnson paid a lot I figured why not. I drove to his house, borrowing my dad's car since I didn't have one back then, and got there in a little bit less than 3/4 of an hour. When I got there, I saw Mrs. Johnson waiting in the car, while Mr. Johnson was at the door waving at me. He gave me the keys and told me to not invite more than one person. He told me his son, Danny, was upstairs and that I needed to feed him before he went to bed. So when he left, I spent like half an hour just feeding Danny and getting him to bed. It was a bit tedious, but it was worth it, I guess. At like 9 o'clock, I was getting bored, so I gave my best friend a call. Unfortunately, she couldn't come over because of some family issues she was having, meaning I had to spend the 5 hours at Mr. Johnson's house alone. This is when everything got strange. I was listening to some songs on my phone, while texting my classmates and stuff, when I heard a knock at the door. I looked at the living room clock, and it was only 10 o'clock. Why would Mr. Johnson be back at 10? I got skeptical. I slowly got up, but before I even got to the door, I heard it again. This time the knock was louder and clearer. It felt like whoever was at the other side was getting impatient. I approached the door and looked through the peephole. I was young but I wasn't an idiot. It took me like 3 seconds to fully acknowledge what I was looking at. There was a man at the other side, a man I hadn't seen before. My heart almost dropped. I didn't recognize him. I thought that maybe he was a friend of Mr. Johnson, so I loudly yelled at him asking who he was. I didn't receive an answer, just another knock at the door. That's when I knew this wasn't a friend or a relative of Mr. Johnson. I yelled for the man to go away, and told him Mr. Johnson wasn't home. The knocking stopped. After 30 or 60 seconds, I looked through the peephole and I saw the silhouette of a man walk away. I was so relieved. I sat back down on the couch. After a couple of minutes, I got hungry, so I went to the kitchen to grab something from the fridge. Just as I opened the fridge, I heard a knock at the door. That's when my body froze in fear. I was so scared I don't know how to describe it. I pulled myself together and built strength to walk to the door and look through the peephole. I was confused, there was nobody outside. Was my mind playing tricks on me? I was so confused. I decided to sit back down on the couch, hoping time would pass quickly so I could get some sleep. A few minutes passed. I was so tired I was almost falling asleep. But then, as I heard a knock coming from the kitchen window, I jumped out of my sit. My body went from sleepy mode to full alert mode within a second. Someone was definitely fucking with me. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. I told the police that someone was possibly breaking into the house, and they said that they'd be there in 15 minutes. For the time being, I slowly walked to the kitchen counter. I grabbed one of the knives and rushed upstairs where Danny was. I went to his room and locked myself in there, with the knife still in my hand. I kept hearing someone knocking on the main door from downstairs every few minutes, but I stayed put, trying my hardest not to break down and start crying. Seconds felt like hours, minutes felt like days. But suddenly, by some miracle, I heard a police siren coming from outside. I looked out the window and saw a car with 3 policemen coming out. I was so relieved. I let go of the knife, as I unlocked the door and rushed downstairs. I'll skip all the boring and full of small details part. Basically, the police then searched the house and the surroundings of the building, but they didn't find anyone. They did, however, find a small pocket knife in the bushes under Danny's window. That's when my heart dropped. Knowing a potential murder was trying to get into the house where I was, still makes me sick to this day. When Mr. and Mrs. Johnson arrived, the police informed them about the incident. They decided to launch an investigation, to avoid any potential risk in the future. I've never babysat at their house anymore, and they still haven't told me who the man that almost murdered me that night was. I'm just glad I'm still alive.